Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a seismic policy shift that is completely restructuring the U.S. pharmaceutical pricing model.
It really is.
And this isn't just one policy. We're looking at a dual assault, really, driven by two very different levers. Voluntary most favored nation, or MFN, agreements on one side.
And then the much bigger mandated Medicare price negotiations on the other.
Exactly.
The key takeaway for you right at the top is that the entire pharmaceutical sector is navigating this massive strategic pivot. You're seeing major companies giving up revenue today on these voluntary deals.
They're essentially buying goodwill.
Goodwill, policy stability, you name it. But at the same time, they're bracing for the long-term reality of statutory price controls from the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a very, very complex risk-reward calculation happening in real time.
So our mission today is to decode that chaos. We're going to unpack the immediate impact of these new MFN deals, map out the timeline for the Medicare negotiations, and then bring it all together, including the legal pushback, to figure out what this really means for the sector.
Let's do it.
All right, let's start with the flashpoint. Just recently, December 19th, 2025, we got this major announcement. 9 more big pharma manufacturers have entered into these voluntary MFN agreements.
And it's a who's who. We're talking Amgen, Bristol Myers Squibb, Boehringer Ingelheim, Genentech, Gilead, GSK, Merck, Novartis, and Sanofi.
So basically all the heavy hitters.
Almost all of them. These 9 joined 5 that had already signed on, so the vast majority of the industry is now playing ball on this.
So what's the core of the agreement? What are they actually agreeing to do?
It all centers on aligning U.S. drug prices with the lowest price paid by other developed nations. But, and this is key, it's for 2 specific groups: Medicaid patients and cash payers on the new Trump Rx platform.
Right. And that cash pay part is where you see the most dramatic, immediate change. The numbers are just staggering.
They really are.
I mean, let's just walk through a couple. Gilead Sciences, their hepatitis C drug, Exclusivity, it goes from almost $25,000.
$24,920 to be exact.
Right. From that down to just $2,425 for a patient on Trump Rx. That's a 90% drop overnight.
An incredible drop. And look at Bristol Myers Squibb's HIV drug, Rayataz. It falls from over $1,400 down to $217.
Even something more common like Amgen's cholesterol drug, Rayalta, is dropping from $573 to $239.
And it's not just the super expensive drugs. Sanofi is listing its insulin products at just $35 for a month's supply on the platform. These are headline numbers. They're designed for immediate visible relief.
But like you said, these are voluntary, so the companies must have gotten something pretty big in return for taking these immediate hits.
Oh, absolutely. This is not charity. The trade-off is huge. Collectively, these 9 companies committed to investing over $150 billion in U.S. manufacturing and R&D.
$150 billion. That's a massive domestic investment.
It is. It's aimed squarely at securing the pharmaceutical supply chain, which is, a major national security concern.
And it goes beyond just a dollar figure, right? There are other commitments.
Yes, a few key ones. They have to repatriate certain foreign revenue back to the U.S. to benefit American patients. And even more concretely, several are donating tons of active pharmaceutical ingredients, the raw materials for the drugs, to the Strategic Reserve, or SAPR.
So they're physically moving product, not just money.
Exactly. Bristol Myers is donating 6.5 tons of apixaban, the key ingredient for a major blood thinner. Merck is donating 3.5 tons of ertapenem, an essential antibiotic. This is about building a real physical buffer against supply shocks.
And Sanofi got a pretty unique carrot in their deal.
They did. Sanofi secured a 3-year exemption from Section 232 tariffs on their imported products. And that's so important because it shows the administration using trade policy as leverage to get these price concessions and domestic investments.
Okay, so that's the voluntary prong, the MFN deals. Quick, painful, but with a trade-off. Now we have to talk about the other, much more powerful prong, the structural one.
The statutory negotiation mandate. This comes from the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. And this is the real long-term game changer.
And it's moving fast. The first round of 10 drugs was negotiated in 2024, and those lower prices hit in 2026.
And that first small batch is expected to save Part D patients around $1.5 billion out of pocket.
But the real focus now is on round 2, which was just announced in November. 15 more drugs.
And for you, the investor, this is the number to watch. Those 15 drugs represent $40.7 billion in annual Medicare Part D spending. That's the revenue that's now directly on the chopping block.
And that list includes the elephant in the room, the GLP-1s, Ozempic, Rybelsus, Wegovy.
All of them. That family of drugs alone accounted for over $14 billion in Part D spending in just 1 year. The government is clearly targeting the blockbusters, the highest volume products.
And the program just keeps expanding. Up to 15 more drugs in 2028, up to 20 a year after that.
It just accelerates.
Which brings us to the core question. What happens if a company just says, no, we won't accept your price?
Well, the consequences are existential. There's really no choice. They face an excise tax on every single U.S. sale of that drug, a tax that can ramp up to 1,900%.
1,900%.
It's a ruinous number. The only way to avoid it is to pull all of your products from Medicare and Medicaid entirely.
Which is impossible. That's 40% of the entire U.S. market.
It's not a viable option.
Yeah.
So the negotiation is, for all intents and purposes, mandatory.
Okay, let's pivot to the investor context. You have this dual pressure. MFN hitting cash and Medicaid now, the IRA aiming at the massive Medicare market long term. How does this change a company's actual strategy?
It fundamentally reshapes it. The MFN deals are like a controlled burn. Painful, but you get something for it. The IRA is the structural wrecking ball aimed right at the net present value, the NPV, of your future pipeline.
And it specifically creates a preference based on the drug's chemistry, which is where we get to the two clocks, the 7-year clock and the 11-year clock. This is the core of the policy pivot.
Absolutely. The IRA creates this huge incentive to develop biologics. The complex injected drugs, usually covered under Medicare Part B, they get 11 years of market exclusivity before they can be negotiated.
11 years. And for the other type?
For small molecule drugs, your typical pills covered under Part D, they only get 7 years.
Just 7. That 4-year difference seems small, but I imagine in NPV terms, it's a lifetime.
It's monumental. Because the development costs are fixed, that shorter runway for small molecules just crushes their potential value. The analysis suggests lifetime revenue for small molecules could fall 5 to 6%, while biologics might only see a 3 to 4% drop.
Which, because of the fixed cost base, means the hit to the actual value of the asset is maybe twice as bad for the small molecules.
Exactly. The message to every R&D department is loud and clear. Simple pills have become incredibly risky unless you can get them to market at lightning speed.
So it forces companies to shift focus. They'll prioritize things with less Medicare exposure, like pediatrics or vaccines, and maybe shy away from areas like oncology or Alzheimer's, where Medicare is the primary payer. It's actively bending the curve of innovation.
It is. And that brings us to the final critical risk factor, the legal fight, because the industry is not taking this lying down.
The court challenges. Novartis is the big one here with their heart failure drug Entresto. They're making a constitutional argument based on the sheer size of the penalty.
They are. They argued in court that if they refused the government's price, the excise tax would escalate to an annual fine of $93.1 billion for one drug.
$93 billion.
To put that in perspective, that's nearly double the company's total global annual revenue. It is an unpayable, company-destroying fine.
So the argument is that this isn't a negotiation, it's a forced taking?
Precisely. They're arguing it's a forced sale of private property without just compensation, because there is no real choice. And they're also challenging it on compelled speech grounds.
Because they have to publicly agree the price is fair.
They have to publicly agree to the maximum fair price, which they say forces them to denounce their own market prices and endorse the government's message. It's a fascinating legal battle over the very definition of negotiation.
This is not financial advice.
But with those risks laid bare, we can see the policy landscape very clearly. It heavily favors long-lived biologics, the 11-year clock drugs. And the downside risk for blockbuster small molecules with that 7-year cliff has just exploded.
Okay, so let's use that reality to pitch an outrageous but plausible trade idea, a strategy that directly exploits this policy arbitrage.
Let's do it. We'll call it a policy arbitrage pair trade. On the long side, you target a basket of highly complex, high-cost biologics.
The 11-year drugs.
The 11-year drugs. Crucially, one's covered under Medicare Part B, administered in a clinic, maybe focused on rare diseases. These are the assets that are most insulated from the early negotiation rounds.
Okay, so you're long the protected assets, and you short the vulnerability.
Exactly. You short a major small molecule drug, a pill covered under Part D widely used, and this is key facing a negotiation timeline before 2030. Think of a big oral cancer drug or an immunomodulator. You are explicitly shorting the legislative risk that the IRA is designed to capture.
While going long on the assets, the law indirectly helps.
And there's one more tailwind for the long side of this trade that's really important.
Which is?
The new out-of-pocket cap for Part D. Starting in 2025, a patient's costs are capped at $2,000 a year.
Right. That's a huge deal for adherence.
It's a massive deal.
Yeah.
It means patients can actually afford to stay on these expensive, complex therapies. It dramatically boosts the long-term volume assumptions for the very biologics you'd be long on. So the trade is really a pure bet on that regulatory wall between the two types of drugs.
So, to recap this whole thing, we've detailed the steep, immediate price cuts from the MFN deals.
And we've contrasted that with the long-term structural changes coming from the IRA's negotiation timeline.
We saw how that is bending the curve of innovation away from pills and toward biologics, and we walked through the industry's high-stakes legal fight to redefine what negotiation even means.
And that really leaves us with the final question you should be thinking about. We've seen that policy is fundamentally changing the math on pharma R&D. But is that $150 billion in domestic investment that was secured by the MFN deals? Is that enough?
Is it a sufficient hedge against the value erosion that the IRA is causing for the rest of the industry's pipeline?
Will those domestic production commitments be enough to stabilize earnings and justify the massive long-term R&D pipelines pharma rely on? That is the multi-billion-dollar strategic challenge facing the entire sector right now.
And remember, this analysis is purely for informational purposes. You should always exercise critical thinking when applying this knowledge.